One. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to Organizing in the Time of COVID-19. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press. You may recall that last year I had an extraordinary interview with Rob Wallace uh, about at that time was his book on big farms make big food. And then subsequently, he has published an extraordinary book, a dead, The Dead Epidemiologist, about which we had a long conversation some time ago at the launch. Um, Rob is an evolutionary epidemiologist with the Agroecology and Rural Economics Research Corps, and has been prolific in this period, and I think established himself as a real expert in the field of epidemiology and indeed the biology of the coronavirus. So I want to wish you a very warm welcome back again to the show, Rob.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Okay, well, Rob, so perhaps we begin by just, where are we? What's the current situation in relation to the pandemic? Where are we?
Yeah, well, just reading off the Johns Hopkins map here, we're about approaching 100 million infections, although that might be 100 million COVID infections, and that might be something of an underestimate. It could be as high as 10 times that. We're at 2.1 million COVID deaths. The United States is leading on both accounts. 25 million cases here in the US, 10 million or more in India, about 8.8 million in Brazil, 3.7 million in Russia, 3.7 million in the United Kingdom, and so on and so forth. I think we're really unfortunately getting a terrible lesson in what logistic growth is, where we start off small and it's terrible, and then it just the virus is able to find all sorts of susceptibles everywhere, and it just explodes in terms of the number of people infected. And so I think the numbers that pop out for me in the United States, we had 1.7 million infected in the first 4 months, and it was a terrible shock. But casually last week here in the U.S., we had a million cases, new cases, in 5 days.
Oh,
So, I mean, it is an extraordinary shift in terms of what gear we've gone into with the outbreak itself. I would like to share a few things that we've learned that have profound impact on how we think about this outbreak. I mean, the infections are raging so much that the vaccines that have come online. We'll talk more about that in due course, but they presently aren't going to be enough. Jeffrey Shawman of Columbia University, his group estimated that, in fact, probably have more like 105 million Americans have been infected. But if we were to get everybody vaccinated and just stop the non-pharmaceutical interventions like masks and social distancing, and say in February, we would add on another 29 million people infected. That has to do with how long it takes to roll out the vaccine. And also, the vaccines are not sterilizing, meaning you get infected, the vaccine might keep you from getting ill, but you can still transmit it to somebody else. So, this silver bullet is not anything of the sort, and we're still trapped in the place that we needed to do the kind of full out public health intervention that the Chinese, New Zealand, and other countries have done. So, and we can talk more about why we can't do that.
but
Uh,
why
yeah.
are vaccines not available? What's the problem?
Well, they thought it was going to be, the failure of political leadership, not only in terms of Trump, but it goes back 40 years to the neoliberal intervention of basically turning public health, either demoting it or monetizing it in such a way that we lost the capacity to engage in these kinds of interventions. Health was basically devolved into something that you and your doctor talked about. So that was where the interventions took place, if you can afford it and if you actually had health insurance. Even after Obamacare, we have 28 million Americans who don't have insurance and 44 million Americans who are underinsured. So even that mode of intervention of just seeing your doctor isn't going to be enough. So they come, outbreak here in the U.S. and other countries, and Britain, Brazil come to mind. They come in, wipe out, infect millions, and there's no capacity to actually engage in the kind of non-pharmaceutical interventions that China, New Zealand, South Korea, Taiwan, other countries have been able to do. So it was as if opposed to the prime directive of the country of keeping the economy running and capitalism accruing. And so the thought was, well, we're going to get this vaccine, and then that will put the genie back in the bottle. But unfortunately, you also need a public health system to actually distribute the vaccine in addition. So the failure to distribute the non-pharmaceutical interventions, whether that's contact tracing, whether that's mailing everybody a box of PPE every month, that failure to actually have that system there, like a society, that failure also undercut the capacity to actually distribute the vaccines. So Biden comes into office, discovers that Trump actually had no vaccine distribution plan whatsoever. He basically dumped it on the states to actually take care of business, but he would alert the states, the feds would alert the states only a couple days beforehand that their vaccines were prepped and available, offered no help in terms of distributing them. And the states, already on their heels from all the hospital capacity, they weren't in a position to be able to have a quick turnaround time. Some states are doing better than others, but you have millions and millions of vaccine shots, often having to be kept in, refrigerated to a point that even under low temperatures, they'll go bad at some point. So even as the U.S. was able to get many a vaccine in a way that many countries of the global south don't have access to, there's certainly appeared to be squandering the supply that they have.
So I think the point that you make is a really important one, which I think escapes many people. That it's not merely a magic bullet. In the absence of social distancing, of contact tracing, of PPE, and so on. So the speed with which people are being vaccinated seems to be much slower than the speed of spread. And it seems to be a mathematical issue. If you can't keep up with it, you're going to go down. Is that the scenario that you see?
Well, the impression, the thought was that, well, you know what? Yeah, that is happening. The virus is spreading faster than we're distributing it. But if we would vaccinate enough people up to a level in which we could engage in the kind of herd immunity that would allow, basically cut off the supply of susceptibles for the virus, that we're going to incur considerable damage in the next couple of months, but we would be able to spread. And unfortunately, some new data coming in from the Louis Bass's group indicates that this thing we call herd immunity may actually not exist for COVID-19 the way we thought it was. They looked at the COVID antibodies in people in Manaus, Brazil, northern Brazil. They found, and that was a point, this is a Bolsonaro special, so they just let COVID rage and uninterrupted, and they found that 76% of the population they tested actually had antibodies for COVID in October, and yet the virus continued to march along. So that seems to indicate that, at least in some populations, getting everybody infected, whether by so-called natural infection or vaccine, may not be enough to actually keep the virus from continuing to march on. There is also, so that leads
why
to...
is that?
That's a good question. I mean, some of the thoughts about it went along the lines that maybe they kind of overestimated the attack rate, and that Manaus hadn't reached its herd immunity threshold. There was a thought that maybe those who are infected, naturally infected, as it were, have only immunity for a few months and then are returned back into the pool of susceptibles. So you're not, I mean, certainly they've known for a long time that your antibody coverage is only for a few months. There have been controversy over whether or not your T cell attack could be mounted for anything longer than that. The assumption that it would be there for a while is being contradicted by other data that indicates it too goes away. So the worry, of course, is that like other coronaviruses, the alpha coronaviruses are more the cold viruses, the beta coronaviruses are the more SARS-like viruses. And the worry is that they'll act in a way like the cold does, which is to, in essence, suppress the immune response and basically free up the susceptible for another round the next cold season. Except we might end up having to do this with something like COVID, which is a terrible thing to think about, just on virtue of the fact that coronavirus knocks back our immune system, resets us, throws us back into the pool of susceptibles. The other issue, of course, is that our SARS here, our COVID-19, is actually evolving. And so this is the big news the last couple months for many establishment scientists, that you have these new variants that are emerging, starting in Britain, but also now in Brazil and the United States as well.
But, I mean, but that's what viruses do. I mean, there's constantly mutations that evolve. Not many of them are particularly successful. I mean, you've talked about the flu virus and talked about how it uh, perpetrates and what are the conditions under which it then finds a successful mutation which then spreads. What are those conditions? What makes it? What I mean, come on. I mean, there's epidemiology 101. There are a few things you have to do, bang, and it's dealt with. So what's happening? Why? What is causing a series of successful mutations to take hold?
Right. So, unfortunately, many of our top epidemiologists have to actually return back to the Epidemiology 101 class that you suggest. We have, in the early days of the outbreak, some of the U.S. epidemiologists expressed outrage when the Chinese informed everybody that SARS-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, actually can spread before those infected express symptoms. That's different from SARS-1 and MERS, the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome virus. Those only typically spread only upon expressing the symptoms. And so even if you don't have a vaccine, you can, in essence, once someone expresses symptoms, you could isolate them and stop the chain of infection. So when the Chinese announced that it wasn't the case for SARS-2, that you can actually transmit it before you express symptoms, and therefore we can't rely on that kind of 19th century public health about just isolating people. U.S. Scientists were outraged. They denounced the Chinese. They said, and I'll name names, I've done it before. Mike Osterholm, who's very well known here in the U.S., said that in all his years of experience with these kinds of coronaviruses, no virus like that had ever done anything like that. It's strange because, as you brought up, pathogens evolve, and this is an RNA virus, and although it has what's called a spell checker, it does go back and correct mutations for the most part. It is still an RNA virus, and it does evolve quite quickly, and it can. And even as it emerged out of Wuhan as a particular genotype there, in the course of spreading around the world, it begins to encounter all sorts of different types of populations, both in terms of the general immune system, the underlying genetics of the people involved, the public health systems. And so, in essence, we end up running multi-thousands of experiments, as it were, by which the virus is confronted with new circumstances and it evolves. And that's natural selection, right? We do know that pathogens are as much, in fact, they're in many ways more able to engage in the kind of natural selection and the speed of what that involved, given its short generation time and its high mutation rates. And so it's able to explore its evolutionary space in a much more easy and free way than most of the hosts that it infects. So what the virus is doing is engaging in what's called interdemic selection. And a deme is just another word for a population. Inter is obviously between, so between population selection going on. So you'll have so in places where the virus is allowed to spread, and if you remember early on, that was the strategy for some of the neoliberal and all authoritarian countries, that they were just going to let it go and let it spread and make its way toward herd immunity, that the more people infected would then we would arrive at a population protection again. But of course, we just heard that we just talked about that is a quasi weird notion that you may not actually get to herd immunity. But what we do instead is you engage in what we're calling herd multiplicity, meaning the more you allow the virus to spread in a country, the more opportunity the virus has to experiment with the immune systems it encounters and to evolve these new variants in such a way that it will allow it to spread faster. And so we see in Britain, for instance, the B117 variant emerged in southeast in London and southeast England, right? And I took upon myself to naming it the Bojo strain after Boris Johnson. And it wasn't merely an attack on a politician who I don't like. It was made to make an important point that these pathogens aren't just merely evolving in response to the immunogenetics of the underlying host population. They're responding in part to the opportunities that we provide them. So if, as Prime Minister of Britain, you make a decision to let the virus spread throughout the entirety of the country, then you, in essence, have allowed the virus the capacity to experiment in such a way that it even an RNA virus with a spell checker will evolve multiple kinds of mutations in a way and amino acid replacements that have been shown to allow this particular strain to be 50% more infectious than the one that had been previously circulating. The other thing that people said, and this really gets at the strange thing about establishment science, the really erring on the side of that nothing bad can happen. And it really just speaks in part because if I may use the technical term, they're scared shitless because, what if these terrible things actually devolve into a worse direction? And, the apparent lack of imagination, constrained by imperial imperatives to make sure that a system that brought about the outbreak must be able to continue to go on that way. And so the thought was, well, one, you know what? At least it might be spreading faster, but it's not it's not deadlier. And it happens to be in the last week or so that Boris Johnson himself announced that government scientists appear to have some preliminary data to the effect that it is the strain is deadlier than the previous one circulating. Although that might be a function of it finding its way to more susceptible populations. That's it's still not finalized, but there's a lot of research involved indicating that virulence could very much be selected for the faster a strain spreads. Long story short, if you're a virus in a host, you don't want to kill your host before you can get into the next host. Yeah. So there's a cap on how much of a badass you can be. But if the next host is right there, then it selects for strains that can get to the replication threshold within any one host so it can get into the next host faster. And those strains that get to that threshold faster, thereby causing more damage to the host, meaning that it's deadlier, are also those strains that are able to pop into the next person in the transmission chain there, and then away you go, and you get to burn through the population. I mean, right now, most countries, a lot of countries, we're only at 20% of people infected, although it might be more than that. So we're nowhere near anything of what so-called herd immunity might be at. There's a lot of room for the virus to play with, a lot of ways to experiment. So you can have millions of people infected and still be nowhere near done with the pandemic.
People often talk about this term herd immunity. I mean, can you help us ordinary people actually understand what that is supposed to mean?
Right. Well, the thing is, when you get infected, you develop immunity to the infection at some point, assuming that you survive it, right? So you have antibodies against it. You have T cells, memory T cells that remember this fucker who came in and infected you. So you really know you're in a place where you can, in essence, defend yourself should you be exposed to the virus again, right? Now, if many of us are in that position, and you have, let's say, 1,000 people, and you've got 750 people have been infected and have this immunity to it now, then the virus doesn't know where to go because most of the people it encounters are going to mount an immune response in a way that keeps the virus from spreading, including into people who've never been infected before. So there's where the herd immunity comes in, where you have enough people who have immunity to stop the virus from spreading beyond that.
Right. Is that something you're saying that that's not likely to happen with COVID-19?
Well, I would say that I want to say two things. One, I would say what we're learning now is that there is no magic number where you go 75% of the population is infected or gets vaccinated, and that'll be enough to basically lock the pathogen out, and then it'll have this local collapse and not be able to re-enter the population. And I'm saying that because we lose immunity in rapid order. The antibody immunity goes in a way in a matter of months, and the T cell thing maybe looking at a year or two maybe. And it's remarkable. And we all know this. Like colds come in every year, new cold. Sometimes it's a different species entirely, but sometimes the new variant that comes in. And some variants have evolved out from underneath our immune response. Some variants, and sometimes our immunity goes away. And so, on that account, that would indicate a couple things. One, uh, being infected may not be enough of a barrier. So you may not be contributing to the herd immunity, as we began our conversation with when we discussing Manaus, right? All the people were infected, 76%, and still the pathogen rages. But it also, maybe another population, 75% would be enough. But now we don't know. We have no idea. So what we don't know hurts us because we can't go, oh, we'll just go for 75% and we have things in hand because the virus isn't cooperating with us that way. We can, if we don't know whether or not 75% is enough, then we go, well, doing vaccines isn't enough. And we're in a position to have to continue to do non-pharmaceutical interventions until such time that the virus will eventually peter out, assuming that it doesn't go influenza way and just comes back every year and is endemic. And one assumes that we'll develop enough immunity that even if you're reinfected, you'll have enough antibodies to mount an attack, and over the years it'll become attenuated. But that's an assumption that we continue to err on the side of good news that we don't have. Um,
But I mean, you're painting a rather bleak picture of the way this virus is spreading. But help me understand why uh, in the Korean Peninsula, both South Korea and North Korea, Vietnam, Kerala, New Zealand, uh,
yeah.
Cuba. I mean, it's not as if there aren't countries where action has been taken. So why? What is it? Why is it that they are able to deal with this seemingly uncontrollable virus when with such little resource actually devoted to
because they saw governance as something that a government should do rather than letting a pathogen come in and wipe out its population. They go, oh, we should not have a deadly pathogen circulate among our population. So they rejected the notion of letting any notion of herd immunity. And we see even some of the major journals here in the U.S. And Science put out a report on the Manaus study that I was talking about, and the commentary basically concluded we can't do this mitigation thing where we're just going to let a virus come in and out and let the economy come up when the virus when the infection load is low. Where we have to engage in the kind of suppression that other countries have done. So China, New Zealand, the South Korea, Taiwan, they right from the start engage in the full court press necessary, because causality is not merely in the matter of the virus itself or the molecular genetics of it. It has to do, just because a virus is so microscopic, it's very hard to see. Its impacts and its causes extend out beyond into the social system in which we're all a part of. So what you do is you do full contact suppression, in the sense of that you have a remarkable testing regimen of testing everybody. You have contact tracers numbering in the hundreds of thousands that go door to door, check up on people. You do full court lockdowns when necessary, and you do them for a long time. And you don't do this half-ass stuff where people, you don't do it in a way that all the professional managerial class gets to stay at home, and all the people taking care of that class have to go to work. Because when Black and brown people are forced to go to work to pay their bills, they get infected and continue the cycle of the virus circulating. Or you force Black and brown people into meatpacking plants so they can feed the managerial class who get to stay at home. That kind of class-specific divide is not epidemiology. It's just ideology encountered in the viral flesh, as it were. And so, what China, New Zealand did was they said, and these are vastly different political systems, they're not very similar to each other, but they said, stay home, we'll pay for you to stay home, we'll feed you, we'll test you on the regular, and we're going to dry up the pool of susceptibles that the virus needs to be able to continue. And they tested people at the airports. An example I remember was that of, if I remember, Taiwan, which would basically everybody who came in the airport was tested, not once, but twice. They were subsequently, the government paid for taxis to take people directly to their hotel rooms where they had a quarantine. They were given apps. Some of them some of us might consider a little creepy, but they tell you where you can buy medicine and mask in the neighborhood. There's another app that shows who's also infected in the neighborhood. So, they saw epidemiology as, and these are all non-pharmaceutical interventions. This has nothing to do with a vaccine or antiviral or anything. I mean, they full court suppressed things in 4 months, and come like July or June, we were all worried. 4 months, it's a long time, and here we are, closing in on month 10 here in the U.S., although the virus was circulating here by December and January. But I think 9-10 months is a terrible ordeal to go through, in part because we've been abandoned by a government who presumed that the problem would solve itself, that the market would solve it. And I think it comes out of, these neoliberal regimes have, in essence, abandoned public health in favor of modes of medicine that involved an exchange of money, a lot of it too. And the terrible irony, of course, is that those countries that let their economies stay open, not only did they lead to hundreds of thousands of deaths of their own citizens, but they also smashed their own economies. Those economies that actually took care of business in short order, 3 or 4 months, not any fun. But now on the other side, we have, rock shows in Wuhan and, rugby in New Zealand. And I look at these pictures of tens of thousands of people in New Zealand going to a rugby match. And I'm stirred by envy on one hand, appreciation for what the people of New Zealand and China have done, and being completely, in some sense, demoralized by what our government has done here to the people of the United States and other countries as well. Britain and Brazil come to mind.
Okay, so I mean, here you have in it's extraordinary scale of spread and deaths happening in the U.S. Now, supposing you were given Fauci's job and said, okay, go and tell us what needs to be done. What needs to be done when it's at this scale?
Well, I have such mixed feelings of being asked to do what Fauci did because, frankly, that man has a lot of blood on his hands. He was able to pass off the worst of the damage onto Trump, and Trump is. But Fauci went along for the ride, gave Trump a lot of bad advice at the front end of the outbreak, uh, bright-sided the notion that COVID-19 was just going to be like influenza. He published papers to that effect. And he's been in office there since the Reagan era, spearheading Ronald Reagan's efforts on HIV. What does that tell you? Um, so, and right now we have our version of the Bojo strain, and I toyed with the notion of naming the new Californian variant that's spreading faster. That's really lit Los Angeles on fire after Fauci himself. I mean, Trump's the obvious one, but the complicity here across party lines is devastating to the point that while Brazil's in the business of ramping up, thinking of impeaching Bolsonaro for the COVID deaths, here in the United States, we impeached Trump twice because he attacked the other arm of the empire. Rather than impeaching him for 400,000 American deaths or the concentration camps on the border, right? So I don't want Fauci's job if Fauci's job is involved in, bringing about the deaths of many Americans. However, what would I do instead? I mean, that's the point. And to be at this point, this is what I would do. And you look at Biden's plan, it's better than Trump's, but it's still entirely not up to code in terms of, there's a lot of discussion about how Biden's following the science. No, he's not. Biden is not following the science. The science says you have to go full suppression. There really isn't herd immunity. You have to engage in the kind of house-to-house firefight that China did on that end. New Zealand didn't have to do that because they took care of business from the start. But basically, go full lockdown for 4 months, pay people to stay home. It's going to suck. I'm sorry. And you hire hospital staffing and contact tracers that match the scale of the outbreak. And so here, the Biden plan proposes 100,000 new contact tracers to help out, track people down, see who they've been hanging out with, so you can follow up with who they may have actually infected, right? 100,000. There are apps online which you can look at, punch in numbers about what your area would need in terms of contact tracers. I did that for St. Paul, Minneapolis here. Mm-hmm. And just this area, and this was a few months ago before we really took off in this wave, we needed 6,000 contact tracers just for the two cities here. So they're going to have 100,000. So the Biden plan, the 100,000 isn't anywhere near enough in terms of the scale of the outbreak. So you have to, in essence, In essence, you have to scale up to do with that. There's aspects of pressing a pause on capitalism, in the sense of we have to give money to people to survive, and not just as in their identity of helping bring about profit for somebody else. So other than essential workers who should be paid uh, um, hazard pay and all this other stuff, everything else needs to be locked down, and it's a terrible blow to your economy. But it's much many of these economies, as I stated earlier, are suffering worse than those places, those countries who saw themselves as more than being a stock market with a country attached to it. They saw themselves as being the governments of people who they served, and whether or not you can point out all problems that governments have. But at the end of the day, many of these governments said, okay, our people are under attack, or they could be under attack. We're going to do what we have to do for public health, because it's public health is still weaved into the notions of governance, and we're going to take care of business. And here in the United States, we haven't. So I would, in essence, if I was in a position to do that, however, my guess is not only would I be fired, I'd probably be jailed by the end of the month, because the U.S. is in essence run by billionaires. And, you could see them turn against Trump at the election. You could see how upset they were in terms of what happened here January 6th and the attack on the Capitol. And political power here isn't just exercised through political donations. You have the bourgeoisie, in essence, organizing politically in a way to make their needs met. So if you had some radical public health guy taking Fauci's job, and he would never get into that position. I mean, this is the filtering process. The filtering process is in the hiring. The filtering process is in the firing. The filtering process is in the grants sent out. And so it would require, in essence, a foundational shift in the nature of the country, and we would have to have a new form of, type of governance and how we do things here. But there are things practically minded to actually intervene and get us out of this. Yes.
Right. I mean, when I first came across you, Rob, I was struck by your arguments in Big Farms Make Big Flu, and which you then enriched and elaborated upon in Dead Epidemiologist, origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. But it seems to me that the original conditions that have created Ebola, SARS-1, SARS-2, etc., um, are still in existence. I mean, and indeed expanding. If one looks at the nature of land grabbing in Africa, for example, the deforestation that is taking place, the commercial industrial agriculture, the industrial livestock production, all of these things that you highlighted in these two books, that are the generating function for the production, not just of mutations, but of new variants. Are we talking about a possibility of COVID-22, COVID-23, etc.? And what, I mean, what do you see is happening in that sense? And what needs to be done? What are the forces that need to be built up to challenge the continued generation of the conditions for uh, more viable and more virulent viruses, which are um, zoonotic viruses?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to start off with just COVID itself and the other SARS-like pathogens that are circulating, it was a study out of China that showed that what our COVID-19 is doing now in terms of playing around and experimenting with the various variants to become more infectious or more virulent or less so, or that the SARS-like coronaviruses in the various bats from Central to South China do exactly the same thing. their spike genes, proteins are mutating, and they're always exploring the evolutionary space in which it experiments with how to spread not just among bats, but once it spills over into livestock or wild foods or into humans. So COVID 22, 23, and 24 are certainly, in my view, well on their way. Whether or not, it takes a lot of hard work to become a pandemic in that way. But once we have the Chinese version of what you explained is ongoing, right? So the deforestation, the encroachment on the last of the South Central Chinese forests, the guano mining, all sorts of things that, in essence, increase the interface between these bats and other animals of reservoirs of other diseases and humans, and stripping out the complexities of these forests that, in essence, acted as a buffer between these reservoirs and us. And this is hand in glove with the capitalist system. It's engaging, as you were getting at, the land grabs into the last of the so-called virgin farmland. You know, when I was in third grade, I'd look at a map, and even then I realized we were in a lot of trouble. But I saw on the map that we had at least the Amazon and the Congo, the lungs of the earth. And of course, we wouldn't do anything to destroy
Sure.
that because we need our oxygen. But lo and behold, the companies, multinational agribusiness, mining, logging, are cutting into the last of the forest because that's the last of it. So it's not a selection process for conservation. In fact,
Mm.
it's the other direction. It basically lets a fire on the companies to cut into what the last of it that's there, and that increases the rate of spillover of these zoonotic pathogens, also the diversity of them. So it isn't just the coronaviruses that are doing that. You have the various Ebola viruses that are doing that. You have all sorts of, yellow fevers become resurgent again. So, it's just what happens. It's tied hand in glove with a lot of the damage that comes out of climate change as well. Previously, it was a situation where the global north treated the global south as both its refrigerator and its toilet. So it took all the resources from the global south and it left all the damage down there to the deaths of millions of people every year. But now they've generated so much damage that they're producing what the philosophers call hyperobjects, meaning problems that are everywhere all at once. And that's what climate change is, and that's what pandemics are, emerging directly out of the exploitation of the global north in the global south. And so if you want to get out of that, you have to engage in the broad global shift in decolonization, developmental parity between global north and global south. You have to engage in the kind of rewilding in the hands of the indigenous and smallholders who know how to do that, rebuild back the food forests that provided the buffers between the wild reservoirs of disease and humans, and cut out the kind of global capitalism that produces these circuits of capital that allow places like New York, Hong Kong, and London to pay for development deforestation in every part of the world. So it involves a profound shift in civilization. So we are at a historical threshold that's it's some sort of eco-socialism or barbarism, and we have no choice to openly discuss this thing in a way that, frankly, many establishment scientists has refused to, and in a way that refusal in part led to the emergence of a pandemic that continues to kill hundreds of thousands of people and
Mm.
may do so through 2021.
Right. So finally, I mean, to organizers who are watching this, What's your main message? What should we be doing?
Yeah, the first thing is I would say you have to break all barriers in terms of finding allies, and that goes from the global north to the global south. I've said that it's going to take internationalism to defeat globalization. So we have to find each other in different parts of the world and organize that way. We have to recognize that there are ethos that aren't necessarily our instinct. So I would say indigenous practices and smallholder practices of basically removing ourselves out of merely the kind of industrial economy and putting humanity back into the natural economy. I'm not saying we to basically completely abandon industrial life or anything, but there is an aspect of, and there's nothing wrong with appropriating things from nature. We do have a right to survive, but expropriating it to the point that we destroy the very ecology upon which we survive is absolutely ridiculous. And you've seen examples of that from the neoliberal to the left, who accept that as the price humanity pays. But you can't pay that price because that leads to extinction. Other peoples around the world have thought differently for 500 years in the face of what is this horrible trauma called global capitalism. And they've thought of it differently. And those ethoses, I don't understand them all, but I do understand that they are doing it. They treat nature in a different way. We don't have to be all animists from here on out, but in a way, we do have to begin to see humanity's place in the ecology of all things. Um, on a local level, there are people who you don't know who you should. And here in the States, there's a grand divide between rural and urban, and as it is elsewhere. But both Democrats and Republicans, the two business parties, have taken advantage of that, basically in a divide and conquer. You get the poor people in rural and urban fighting each other. And somehow we have to put our hands out and reach out in a way that is often uncomfortable. I'm not saying reach out to Trump is fascist, but there are a lot of people who don't have our political opinion who actually have a lot in common in the sense of the destruction of the town economy in rural areas goes hand in glove with agribusiness coming in and smashing them, farmers and farming communities. That leads to the kind of monoculture production that leads to the emergence of new infections. So if you want to stop these new infections from emerging, we need a new agriculture, and that involves reaching out to farmers who know very much how to do business, but they're often trapped in dealing with paying off mortgages, so they are trapped in agribusiness, and the economy doesn't let them out. So, and I think I draw meaning and sustenance from the example of Martin Luther King. I mean, I have always have, but I've become a greater appreciation for the man. I realized that he was able to get so Coral put up agroecology. Yes, most definitely. We need a new way of farming that integrates growing food in the ecology of life. Right on. But Martin Luther King, what he showed us was that that there is a way to get people. He got millions of people, not just in the U.S. but around the world, interested in what was going on in rural Georgia, rural Mississippi, rural Alabama, and we need to find that imagination to be able to place people's struggles elsewhere in the world in our hearts and in the way we do politics and business. And we need to begin to have people in the streets here in the States. I always think of it, having people in the streets of Philadelphia get an understanding about what's happening in the rural areas of Nebraska and North Dakota, and to understand that their fates are intertwined, and to find the imagination and capacity to work together to push through against a bourgeoisie that operates interlocking one part of the world to the other. And it has come down to that kind of face-off. And then, yes, I see Anna Brown here with Charles Booker. He ran for the Democratic nomination in Kentucky on a progressive platform. His new organization called Hood to Holler, and it's exactly along those lines that people in urban areas and people in rural areas get together and work together that way. So
But
that's what I would say.
you're raising the issue of Martin Luther King Jr. I think it's really important because I think in the conditions where we have this huge infection rate, millions dying, and so on, what we Martin Luther King didn't stand up and say, "I had a nightmare." He said, "I had a dream," and I think we have to be careful not to in a sense be subsumed by a nightmare, but to be able to have the capacity to dream because it is that which mobilizes, I think.
Well, you did invite Dr. Doom onto your show, so I apologize for that part of it. But I do. But what you're getting at is exactly right. I mean, your question to how did China and New Zealand do it? Because they imagine their countries in a way, whatever problems they have in their governance, and we can object to a lot of things. They still saw themselves as a community and a country that was worth saving themselves in a way, while other countries on the back end of their cycle of accumulation, and you look at the U.S. and England, and it's just everybody's just grabbing the bourgeoisie are just grabbing what money's left over, and we need to reject that sociopathy in favor of the notion that we look around at each other and we love each other. We don't have to be misanthropic over what is a terrible moment. I love the music people make. I love the books people write. People are wonderful, and as terrible as things are going as well. But there are certainly wonderful things worth being around about. And it is, I always think it's a beauty and a wonder to be able to walk on the surface of a planet without a spacesuit on. And I think that is worth saving and beautiful and lovely. And to do that, we have to punch back at those who are willing to trash our planet and somehow move to Mars to continue the cycle of destruction there. If anything, we need to save civilizations and other planets, if they are out there, from this model from at all encountering them, because save the Earth, save the universe, from what is a sociopathic ideology that is willing to sacrifice millions of people for a buck.
Well, Rob, it's always an incredible pleasure and incredibly enlightening to have you on the show. And I fear this pandemic is going to continue. We're going to have further conversations with you again. But I want to really thank you so much for sparing time because I know how busy you must be. And so thank you for taking time to talk with us.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Okay, you take care.
Okay, bye.
Bye. That was Rob Wallace talking to us about the current pandemic, COVID-19, and had some incredible insights into the epidemiology and the politics of the spread of the virus. So thank you for joining us on this show. I'm hoping to be speaking to somebody from Zimbabwe next week who has been working on a regular report on the spread of the virus in Africa, in different parts of Africa, and the challenges that are being faced there. So I hope you will join us there next week. This is Firoz Manji saying thank you very much for joining us on Perspectives on Organizing in the Time of COVID. Thank you for joining us.